Okay, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. So now let us start our final session, session 5, which is a panel discussion on policy challenges. And our very last session will be moderated by one of our keynote speakers, who is none other than Professor Robert E. Hall from Stanford University. So without further ado, let me hand over the microphone to him. So please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Lights on. Okay, there we go. All right, so this is the session on policy challenges, and there's only one rule of this topic, and that is that you may not refer to monetary policy as anything other than challenging. But otherwise, I think it's wide open in terms of topic. The format will be 10 minutes per speaker. There are 5 speakers, so that's 50 minutes, and that will leave 40 minutes for open discussion with responses from the panel members. Briefly, our panel is Woosik, who's professor in the Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University and a former member of the bank's Monetary Policy Board. Martin Uribe, who previously spoke, who is the editor of the Journal of International Economics. Michael Ehrmann, head of the Monetary Policy Research Division of the ECB, and previously, for a while, research director at the Bank of Canada. I note that Canada is not a Euro country, but Christopher Waller, who in addition to being executive IP, which seems like a lofty position, but he is a very active researcher as well, with many recent publications in this area. And finally, Ricardo Reis, who, in addition to being the Phillips Professor at LSE, was until quite recently the chief editor of the Journal of Monetary Economics. Okay, so 10 minutes.
First of all, I'd like to thank the Bank of Korea for inviting me to speak on this very important conference. Well, and I also like to thank the organizers for giving me the first chance to speak. Probably the organizers hope that I speak more on the policies of the Bank of Korea I had while I was working. And so this morning we had a very interesting speech on the theoretical issues and empirical issues. But my speech will be more, on the policy side. So let me start with 2 questions which occupied me very much while I was working. And the first issue was actually on the strategy of the monetary policies we are adopting. Please change it to the next page. Okay. So the first issue is on the strategy of the inflation targeting Bank of Korea has been adopting since 1999. And then second issue is concerns the operating procedure Bank of Korea had, especially we have this short-term interest targeting system, and so my remark will be more on these 2 issues. So let me start with the first question, whether this inflation targeting is really appropriate at this stage, at this period. Could you, okay, actually this one, okay. So, well, I was actually very much embarrassed, not at the beginning of my work as a policymaker, but later I realized that this framework was a little bit unsuitable. I think that it is still useful, but I'm wondering whether it's really valid these days. The reason is very simple. The reason is that inflation rate, not just in Korea, but also in other parts of the world, was so low, so that I'm just wondering whether the mechanism inflation targeting would be working properly. Basically, as I understand, there is no firm theoretical foundation for this inflation target. It's more, as I understand, why the inflation targeting had to be introduced was just because of this political agreement that was made between the central bank and the political parties in New Zealand. And since then, most of the countries adopted this framework, but still it's very difficult to find the firm theoretical foundation behind. And actually, I found out that work done by 2 psychologists were rather very good, actually. So basically, what is the core elements of the inflation targeting? I think it consists of 2 elements. One is the announcement of the target, and the second one is this maybe the action, maybe the commitment to achieve the target. But concerning the first issue, especially the announcement target, how this announcement target would affect maybe the inflation expectation of the private people. This is not very clear. But anyway, I think this theory is suggested by the Kahneman is very interesting, especially it gives some explanation why this anchoring is important in stabilizing the expectation. But when is this anchoring mechanism working? This is the important question. Especially when we have so many uncertainties, then anchoring is likely to play a very important role. But if that is not the case, I'm just wondering whether it's working. Right now, we are running very low inflation period, so that probably we do not have that much uncertainties about inflation. But in the 1970s, 80s, or even the early 90s, when inflation rate was that high, then there are those uncertainties, and the inflation volatilities were high, so that probably anchoring mechanism worked very well, but these days, no. So that's maybe one reason why this mechanism is not working. And right now, our concern is also very different. In those days, the main objective of central bank is to stabilize inflation, but right now it's rather create inflation. To some extent, even in Korea, well, I don't think that our inflation is not that low still, but still the main question is not about lowering inflation, it's more or less to create inflation. So if that is the case, could the mechanism suitable? So right now the goal is to achieve the target from below. So if that is the case, is inflation targeting mechanism workable? And furthermore, probably this framework, inflation targeting, could be represented maybe mathematically by the formula I presented here, so that the impact of the announcement or the impact of anchoring is captured by the coefficient lambda in the formula I present here. And actually, this is the result of the empirical studies made by some economists at the Netherlands Bank. Actually, as you see here, the anchoring mechanism worked so well so far. Probably anchoring was so important. But right now, as I mentioned, well, inflation is so low, so that our goal is to create inflation. So this mechanism is not, it's likely not working. And furthermore, well, I don't like to spend much time on this issue, but Phillips curve has flattened, and so that's now quite well known, so that I don't like to spend much time on this issue. But maybe Phillips curve will be still valid, but well, it's not that much useful anyway for policymakers. And as I understand, Phillips curve is really the core for this DSG model, whatever. If Phillips curve is not working, all the theoretical models all the predictions of the theoretical models will break down. So basically, inflation is not that much useful anyway in the policy making. And let me just mention that while I was working at the Bank of Korea, my only concern was on the growth, if you like. I never had a chance to look at the inflation rate for the policy decisions. Obviously, well, inflation rate is always important variable to look at, but frankly speaking, it did not play any role in my decision regarding whether to raise or lower interest rate. The second question concerns the... Okay. Okay, so maybe 5 more minutes, please. No. Okay. So,
30 seconds most.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. But second concerns this transmission mechanism. Basically, well, our operating framework is to focus on short-term interest rate to guide it maybe to long-term interest rate and to the decision of investment, saving, etc., etc. But as I will show here, I try to draw two yield curves, two different cases. One is the case where yield curve is working very well, while the second is maybe the most embarrassing case when I had a chance to work.
Okay, yeah. You're done. Thanks. Okay. Thanks very much.
Okay.
And now we'll move on to Martine. Also, Martine, could you use the lectern?
Yes, of course.
So the timer will be right. Okay. Oh, you've got a timer of your own, I guess.
Yes. All right.
And I think here's your remote.
Okay. So I would like to talk about the issue of whether low nominal interest rates are useful for lifting an economy out of below target inflation or deflation. And typically we do that we do this in the context of models, but since this is a panel table, I will do it in the context of describing through the lens of some theoretical model in mind, two different approaches to monetary policy. One is the Japanese approach, in which interest rates have been kept at zero since 1995, and since then Japan has had many recessions and expansions, and the central bank has stuck to interest rates of zero. And the other is the United States, in which it was always understood that zero interest rates were an unusual response to an unusual situation, namely the Great Contraction. And it was understood from the very beginning that once real conditions normalized, nominal interest rate would also normalize, and that is exactly what the Fed is doing right now. And then I'm going to claim that there are at least two economies that could add more, the Eurozone and Korea, that are at the bifurcation point. They could take either the Japanese route or the US route. So let me talk about 4 graphs according to the list of countries I had before. What you see here is the nominal interest rate, the policy rate, and inflation in Japan. And the vertical lines are the recessions. And as you can see, since 1995, there have been, many recessions. And throughout that period, nominal interest rates have been zero. So you cannot really argue that there is a cyclical component to those zero interest rates. What is a significant feature in this graph is that inflation has been systematically below target. So the best, or one view that I would favor, is that interest rates are low because the BOK thinks that inflation is below target. And another non-exclusive explanation that could be going on at the same time is that inflation is low because nominal interest rates are low. So you're in that situation, the BOJ doesn't change interest rate because inflation is below target, and inflation is below target because interest rates have been low for a very long period of time. Let me move to the US. And what you see here, sorry, there we go, is that it was the US took the very courageous policy of lowering interest rate to all the way to zero during the Great Contraction, but as soon as the contraction was over and the fundamentals of the economy were sound, the United States decided to abandon the zero nominal interest rate policy. Now, this happened in 2015, and I would argue that the most courageous part of the story is precisely to abandon the zero nominal interest rate policy, because in 2015, when the US decided to normalize rates, the inflation rate was still 1 percentage point below target. It was 1% and the target was 2%. But the Fed had the self-confidence to say, well, we see real indicators being sound, all real fundamentals being more or less in the right place, so we are going to normalize rates, even though the inflation rate was below target, significantly below target. The Eurozone has been also taking took a very courageous policy of lowering interest rates all the way to zero during the Great Contraction. But unlike the US, it has kept interest rates at almost zero until now, even though it is understood that in core countries, but especially in the periphery of Europe, real conditions have improved significantly vis-a-vis the first 5-6 years of the Great Contraction. So the question remains, what happens with inflation? So the spike in oil prices brought inflation a little bit close to the target, but since then, inflation has been falling. Now, look back to the United States, and what is remarkable is that the normalization of rates in the United States, even though it started with inflation being 1 percentage point below target, since the normalization of rates, inflation has picked up in the US. So we have seen in the past 3 years a situation in which increasing interest rates were associated with increases in the rate of inflation. If you compare that to Europe, we see that after the spike due to the oil increases in oil prices, inflation has started again to move down away from the inflation target. Finally, let me show you the case of Korea, very similar to what is going on in Europe. Again, Korea took the shrewd policy of lowering interest rate to very low levels during the Great Contraction, and like the Eurozone and unlike the United States, has kept those interest rates very low, and as a result, inflation, or you can take the as a result out and say associated with that, the inflation rate has been below target throughout. So very different from what we have seen in the US, which is a process of normalization of rates together with an increase in the rate of inflation. So to conclude, I go back to the initial question: do low interest rates help fend off or lift the country out of deflation? And the body of work on which I'm basing my discussion here, my informal discussion here, would inform us that the answer is yes, if the lowering of interest rates is understood to be temporary, and by that I mean that interest rates would be normalized once the real conditions are also normalized. And the answer is no, if the lowering of interest rate is understood as a policy of indefinite duration. Now, Korea and the Eurozone, I could add more countries there, like the UK, are at the point at which they could make a decision to either take the Japanese route or the US route. Which way things are going to go lies entirely in the hands of central banks. And here I'm emphasizing the adverb, I would say, entirely. So it lies entirely in the hands of central banks to emphasize that in the context of the fiscal policies that characterize these countries, the decision to move away from zero interest rates in a permanent fashion through, say, a gradual normalization is entirely a monetary phenomenon, and as a result is the responsibility of the central bank. Okay, I'm going to stop.
Thank you. Michael.
Okay, thank you very much for having me again here today. I want to actually take this talk from where I left it sort of yesterday and talk a little bit more about guidance provided by central banks and think about how much guidance should central banks provide going forward and in what form. And of course, again, like yesterday, anything I'm going to be saying here right now are my own personal views and not necessarily those of the ECB. So I think it's probably an uncontroversial fact that central banks have provided a lot more guidance since the global financial crisis. For various reasons, obviously there was a lot of economic uncertainty, and so the last thing the central bank wants to do is add uncertainty to that, so it wants to be very clear about what it's doing itself and how it sees the economy going. And so central banks have provided that guidance, and of course then there has also been a very explicit policy instrument, namely forward guidance, where the central bank talks about how it sees the evolution of the own policy path. And the third type of guidance that has been provided by central banks is what I talked about yesterday, very explicitly, very subtle type of guidance. You know, even when drafting statements, central banks guided the readers of that statement to where they need to look for hints about how they see or where the central bank has updated its information. Much more generally, we have seen that communication has become more forward-looking by central banks. So I plot this here for the case of the Federal Reserve, but you can have similar plots for other central banks. So this is a very simple graphic which just shows you the share of future tense markers per 1,000 words in the Fed minutes and the FOMC statements. And you can see that since the global financial crisis, these communications and the discussions in the FOMC have become more forward-looking. And again, this is what I meant earlier by the central bank providing more guidance about the economic outlook, about how itself sees the future evolution of the economy. And then, of course, the second part of guidance that has been provided by central banks is proper forward guidance. We've recently conducted a survey among central bank governors on the one hand and academic economists on the other hand. And we've asked them, how do you see the role of forward guidance in the central bank toolkit going forward? And as you can see from this chart, there's strong agreement that forward guidance is going to remain a potential instrument in the central bank's toolkit. Academics are more bought onto that than central bank heads, many of whom still think it's too early to judge. But overall, the tendency is towards accepting that forward guidance is to stay with us going forward. And so while you see a lot of agreement on this chart, you see a lot of disagreement between academics and central bank heads on the following chart, on this one here. And what is important to keep in mind here is that forward guidance is not necessarily equal to forward guidance. There's been different ways central bank have introduced and implemented forward guidance. So what we're distinguishing here is in particular calendar-based forward guidance, i.e. forward guidance where the central bank lift off of policy rates from the lower bound to a specific calendar date. There's data-based forward guidance where liftoff is connected to economic evolution, so some economic threshold. There's also purely qualitative forward guidance where the central bank communicates that it expects interest rates to be low for an extended period, so there's no strings attached to that effectively. And you can see that the academics are very much in favor of data-based forward guidance, probably not so surprising because textbook forward guidance is state contingent, so this is what we all read about when we read Woodford, for example, and academics seem to be very much in favor of that, whereas central bank governors are much more equally distributed across the various options that we have here. If anything, they seem to prefer purely qualitative forward guidance. And again, maybe this is not so surprising because this is with the least strings attached, so it gives them more freedom to opt for different policies going forward. So I think this is interesting, and I think we want to have more research on what is actually, what are the effects of these different types of forward guidance, and I want to present you a little bit of this here. I have a paper where we run 2 different types of tests to be in my time frame here. I'll only be showing you one, and this is how do government bond yields respond to macroeconomic news. So there's papers by Swanson and Williams, for example, which show that under forward guidance, there's a muted responsiveness, and this is what you should expect. If interest rate expectations are anchored, if forward guidance is credible, then you should respond less to macroeconomic news. Now we want to look at the different types of forward guidance, and what you see here in the red box here right now is sort of the benchmark coefficient that you would need to keep in mind. So in the absence of forward guidance, government bond yields respond to macroeconomic news in a statistically significant manner and with a coefficient that is probably not very meaningful right now, but it's 0.41. Now we want to compare this to the other types of, or to forward guidance, and in particular the various types of forward guidance. At the very bottom of the table, we have calendar-based forward guidance with a very long horizon, and that seems to be extremely effective in basically cementing interest rate expectations. So there's no responsiveness to any incoming data anymore. State-dependent forward guidance is somewhere in the middle, so you have a muted responsiveness, but there is still some responsiveness going on, and I think this is very much in line with the spirit of state-dependent forward guidance because liftoff is actually connected to the evolution of the economy. If you look at open-ended forward guidance, the purely qualitative type of forward guidance, we see no effect. So it seems to be completely ineffective in that sense. And actually, we find even a perverse effect of short horizon calendar-based forward guidance. So markets seem to be looking through the guidance horizon that the central bank provides and already start wondering about what's going to be happening afterwards. So they are extremely responsive, in particular if the central bank doesn't have any quantitative easing in place. So you see in the second and the third column distinction between QE and without QE, and the perverse effect really comes from the situations where there is no QE. So this seems to suggest that forward guidance can be made more credible if the central bank also embarks on QE. And again, that's very much in line with the textbook idea of forward guidance. So let me skip the second type of analysis just to say that we find very consistent results also if we look at disagreement across economic forecasters about the future path of interest rates. We find effectively that long horizon forward guidance reduces disagreement pretty much entirely. State dependence sort of halves the disagreement. And again, if you have QE in place, this seems to be making forward guidance much more effective, regardless of the type of forward guidance that is in place. So what do I want to take from this for the discussion here in this panel? Well, I mean, clearly we're going to have less forward guidance of this proper type going forward if central banks start to lifting rates, and Martin has sort of advised that central banks should be doing this sooner rather than later. So this type of forward guidance is going to be observed much less frequently. I've also yesterday already talked about how the Bank of Canada was getting out of the guidance by drafting its statement. So generally, I think we're going to see less guidance by central banks going forward. And you know, if we think about not necessarily sort of the big turning points about liftoff from zero, about tapering, or about ending asset purchases, if we think about incremental steps, policy rate increases, for example, I think very much in line with this analysis, what we're going to be seeing going forward is much more stressing of the data dependency of central banks' policy decisions, more emphasis on the central bank reaction function, and less emphasis on the time contingent forward guidance. So my expectation, therefore, would be that for some time, we're going to be seeing more surprises with regard to monetary policy decisions by central banks. Not necessarily that the direction of a certain move is unexpected or that the magnitude of a certain move is going to be unexpected, but the precise timing might be unexpected. So it might happen at the next meeting rather than the meeting after that, or the other way around. This has happened in a number of cases already. Central banks have gotten a lot of criticism, a lot of heat for doing this, but I think we're bound to see more of that as central banks sort of step out of this time contingent guidance and are going to be stressing their reaction functions much more going forward. And I think it's going to be a learning process whereby financial markets need to sort of learn that they need to put more emphasis on the incoming data as opposed to being guided exactly about when and what meeting which exact decisions will be taken. And with that, I would conclude. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank the organizers for including me on the conference program. So when I sat down to think about what to say, we were told to look over the topics from the previous 2 days, and one of the topics was central bank communication. So I thought I would touch on that, and follows up. It's related to what Michael just said. Here's the usual disclaimer. The reason I'm focusing on this is I really, really mean it for what I'm going to say. So this is one thing. When I left academia and went to the central bank, you learn how important in the last, since the financial crisis, how important central bank communications are for conducting what I'm just going to call good, quote-unquote, policy. And I'm going to take it, rather than interest rates, which I think Michael was tending to focus on, I'm going to think about balance sheet policy actions as examples of good and bad communication that we've done. The bad one, was our tapering announcement in 2013. The good one was our balance sheet runoff plan that we released last year. So let me just go back. Actually, Janelle kind of hinted at this by the June 2013 FOMC meeting. So in 2013, the FOMC was beginning to think about tapering the asset purchases, not ending them, but tapering them. And the first public mention of this was in Chairman Bernanke's testimony before the Joint Economic Committee, where in response to a question about ending the QE, he said, well, if the economic conditions are right, we could start doing this over the next couple of meetings. Like very quickly. Okay? And then after the June FOMC meeting, the decision was made that he would go out at the press conference and announce basically that, yeah, we're going to start tapering probably in the next couple of meetings. Okay? Now, my boss, Jim Bullard, dissented, as Janelle pointed out, at this meeting. The only dissent he's ever had in 10 years, and it was because of this. He came across thinking, we haven't prepared markets, this is very hawkish, and this is going to be a bad outcome. Furthermore, we should be doing this in the statement, not in a press conference. And sure enough, that's what happened. We got a taper tantrum. 10-year Treasury rates went up almost 50%, 80 basis points in a matter of days. 80 basis points. If you ever look at this market, that's like a massive earthquake in movements of asset prices. Okay? So here's just a picture. Since I run Fred, I like to throw Fred graphs out once in a while. So you can just see that rates were down around 160 basis points roughly, 160, 170. The chairman's testimony, within minutes of that statement, markets, these things started moving up. And then when the announcement came, bang. So this is exactly, I'm just showing a picture, this is what Jim was afraid of. This was going to come off very hawkish because we hadn't prepared markets for this. And sure enough, that's what happened. So that's really what I want to point, why was this bad? This sounds crazy to academics that markets need more than like a month to digest these actions. But I've kind of come to believe this really is what happens. I don't know if it's a lack of credibility. I don't know if it's reversing course in the past. But one thing's for sure, markets were not ready for this. And they were caught off guard. Okay? Now, the other thing is once the initial shock, the reading was, well, in the next couple of meetings, well, it's June, there's a meeting in July, it must be September. September rolls around, the markets had adjusted, got ready for it, and we didn't do it. So this was clearly an example of, we just created more confusion about future policy actions. So I'm going to step forward a bit. So in late 2016, we started thinking about balance sheet normalization again. The Fed had announced that normalization of the balance sheet would start when normalization of the federal funds rate was well underway. Now, this was kind of a rough thing. This is roughly maybe 18 months or so, 18 months to 2 years after liftoff. Well, by the end of 2016, we were starting to say, look, this is going to come up in 2017. So Jim and I were talking late 2016 and thinking, if you want to avoid a repeat of the taper tantrum, we got to start talking about this now. We can't wait till about a month or 2 months before we do it and then suddenly say, oh, guess what? We're going to start letting our balance sheet run off. So that's what happened. Oops, I think I've got an extra. So Jim decided to start going out in public and speaking in interviews and talks saying, look, you've got to remember, one of the things that's going to happen soon in the next 6 months to a year is we're going to start shrinking our balance sheet. Okay? Now, other FOMC officials also began talking about this. Bill Dudley did it in January or February. Other Fed presidents began talking about it. And I think Janet finally started making some mentions of it in late spring. So in June, we announced a policy. It was very detailed. That was the other problem with the original taper tantrum. When Chairman Bernanke said, we're going to start tapering, the first thought was, well, how much? 50 billion? 40 billion? Is it treasuries? Is it MBS? There was no statement of how the tapering was going to occur. So that's what we did. We announced a very clear, simple path, nothing dramatic, gave it to everybody. And then when we did it in October 2017, what was the market reaction? Boring, which is exactly what you want. Okay, when you're doing something like this, where you're saying we're just going to start normalizing this, we don't want any major reactions. So this is an example of what I think of as good communications. And that was the punchline, that the markets, again, I just find this as an academic, this sounds crazy, but you have to kind of socialize sometimes these concepts that you really are going to start doing this. Okay, and we announced a very detailed mechanical plan. Okay, and we learned that, or at least my interpretation is we learned that from the 2013 taper tantrum, that clear and early communication of some forthcoming policy actions was actually optimal. And to some extent, this applies with our traditional policy tools. So this is just looking at the probability of a rate hike and actually when we do rate hikes. So what you can see is all through the zero lower bound period, markets were always thinking we were going to come off zero. Okay, and we kept talking about it. If you ever looked at the path for the SEP funds rate, starting back in 2011-12, we had this path going up, up. But if you look at the data, we just stayed at zero for years. So finally, when we said, look, we're going to start raising, as you can see, the probability of rate hikes goes almost to 1 on the meetings where we do it. And you can see there's one sitting out there without a red dot. That's next week. So the markets are pricing in almost 100% probability of a rate hike in June. So in some sense, you know, this is another example of how kind of communicating our rate path doesn't lead to big surprises in the market when it actually happens. Whoop. Okay, that's it.
Okay. And the last speaker, Ricardo. You remember that you're held to a particularly tight standard because you're going to talk about our joint work.
That's a little bit towards the end. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to me again. I thought that in this panel I would contribute at the margin by talking about the balance sheet, which was just mentioned now at the end, but the other speakers focus on other things. And just for reference, this is a very short version of the Phillips lecture, which I gave a few weeks ago, and you can see the long version from my website if you happen to be interested or if I'm particularly unclear. What I'm going to talk about is what is the challenge facing the central bank of most of the advanced countries in terms of managing their balance sheet. The operational word here is, as in the speech by Governor Lee yesterday, normalization. Everyone talks about normalization. Jerome Powell, in his very first speech when he was confirmed, said the usual boilerplate, and the only content there was the fact that he was going to normalize. Christine Lagarde talks about normalization, the ECB talks about normalization, everyone talks about normalizing the balance sheet, going back to normal. But what does that mean? What is normal? Now, if you dig into their speeches, there's at least a hint that normal means the way things were in 2005. And how were things in 2005? It was a balance sheet of a central bank, for the case of the Bank of England, for the case of the ECB, for the case of the Federal Reserve, for the case even partly of the Swiss National Bank, that had on its assets short-term treasuries, a standing facility in the form of a discount window, and depending on the size of the country, perhaps some gold or foreign currency in terms of foreign assets. Whereas on the other side, there was currency, fairly stable, although fluctuating with inflation, like we saw yesterday in Juan Pablo's presentation. Deposits by banks, which are often called bank reserves, which were very, very small in the United States, and then the net worth of the central bank, which was close to constant. So this is what it seems to emerge as being what, certainly the speeches of Janet Yellen and now recently of Jerome Powell, emerges as what they see as normal. I'm going to push a little bit against this view insofar as, over the last 10 years, for better or worse, we've ran a lot of experiments in central banking, especially having to do with the balance sheet. And as a result, we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot about new theories. We've learned a lot about new evidence. So we can discuss normals less in terms of what was history, but rather in terms of what is perhaps optimal, or at least close to it. And at the same time, talk about optimum that I'm going to argue is somewhat realistic. Now, I've already talked a lot about standing facilities in my presentation just half an hour ago, so I won't talk about here, about the complements of the discount window in terms of swap lines or auction facilities or others. And I won't talk much about currency. So I'm going to focus instead, given that I have now 7 minutes, on the size of the balance sheet, and especially the reserves, as well as the composition of the assets, and here in particular treasuries. So let me start with the first one. Here's what I think I learned. I learned that when the central bank issued an enormous amount of reserves, that is, it borrowed a lot from banks, that's the blue line here, even as currency didn't change very much, that when it did so, and in particular when it went in QE1 around the end of 2008 from 0 to approximately 1 trillion of reserves in a very short period of time, interest rates, the interbank rate, went to be equal to the interest on reserves. That as I learned that somewhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion is what it takes to satiate the market for reserves, is what it takes for the interest rate on private liquidity being equal to the interest rate on public liquidity. That is, for the interbank rate to be equal to the interest on reserves. So I learned that. Not when interest rate is 0, by the way, but when interest rate, in the case of the US, was just essentially equal or very close to the interest on reserves. I learned then that in this case, monetary policy can be conducted not in terms of targets for an interbank rate, for a private rate, but rather in terms of actual setting a policy rate, in this case, the interest on reserves, then complemented with interest on the reverse repurchase program. Okay. Third, I learned that in the scenario, whereas before, and here on the left what I have is a plot of the distribution of outcomes for inflation as perceived for inflation options markets, that before, when you have a monetary policy announcement, so what I have here is a before and after monetary policy announcement, in this case the announcement of QE1, that is around here, whereas before changes in the size of the balance sheet, announcement of QE1 had a big effect on what expectations of inflation were, what you can show is that for all of these blue wiggles over here, each of these dates of QE, all of them had 0 effect on expected inflation. Essentially, the before and after expected inflation from options were essentially on top of each other. And I showed here 1, but I could have shown you any one of 8 of these. Okay? So I've learned all 3 of these things. What do these things motivate me then to say should be the new normal? First, that this is a good outcome. It's good to have the market for reserves satiated. It's good because we set a rate instead of having to target a rate with all the complications having to do with liquidity premium and others. Because we eliminate liquidity premium on the market by flooding the market with liquidity, with reserves, we can now focus on risk premium, which are perhaps more important. Because it means that whenever we have frequent shocks to the demand for liquidity, in the sense of the demand for reserves, for money by banks, we now, being all the way to the right, having satiated it, can just ignore the demand curve, because we're now at the horizontal side of the demand curve. When it shifts right or left, it's a horizontal curve shifting among itself. I've learned that this reduces the scarcity of safe assets, which seems to have been an important part. That is, it releases short-term treasury bonds or bills, short-term treasury bills from being used for liquidity and thus being released to serve as a collateral, as seems to be very important in markets. Perhaps more importantly, we learned that one of the few legitimate free lunches the economics has discovered, in the word of Bob Lucas, can be realized. Floor system, the interest on reserves being equal to the interbank rate, is the Friedman rule as applied to bank reserves. 0 is as applied to currency. But positive, but with interest on reserves equal to the federal funds rate, is the Friedman rule, a great free lunch that leads to many benefits, we think. And finally, it even opens the idea of to what extent should we have not just banks having reserves of the central bank, but also the public doing so, what nowadays is called fashionably digital currency, and in doing so achieve an even closer point of the Friedman rule in allowing agents to deposit in a limited amount. So for all these reasons, it strikes me as a good idea to have it satiated, in particular because all of these points here seem to have been verified in the data in different ways. And you see the satiation here. This is the histogram from the call reports of reserves to assets across banks. All banks seem to be satiated. It's not just a few banks that hold all of these reserves. How to announce it? Here's my proposal. We will announce an interest rate on reserves, or an RRP, X%, that's the policy tool, and then announce the target for the federal funds rate to be the same X%. It then, when the FOMC no longer says that the size of the balance sheet is a policy tool, but simply says you and the markets team, you achieve an interbank rate of X%. Have the size of reserves be whatever it takes for it to be X%, and no more, or at least no much more. What they will say is that, much like when we instructed the interbank rate to be some in-between number, and what the markets team had to do with the New York Fed was shift the supply of reserves to intersect the demand at some interest rate that was the target for the FOMC. Let's have the target be the point where the market gets satiated, the horizontal point. And tell the markets team the interest on reserves is our policy tool. You have to achieve an interbank rate, a federal funds rate that is essentially equal to it, plus minus 10 basis points if you want, given a lot of issues with it. And then you choose the size of the balance sheet, that is how many reserves we have, where the red line should be in order to go there. What's good about this is that communication goes back to interest rates. Communicating in terms of interest rates, what central banks know how to do and do well. Second, in terms of the assets. In the old days, liabilities and assets of the central bank were close to maturity matched. You had short-term reserves, you had currency, and you had short-term assets. There was essentially a small profit because you had two government liabilities that were very similar to each other on both sides. Post the Treasury-Fed Accord of 1952, this was the consensus at the Federal Reserve. Before that, the Federal Reserve did other things, and that led to a relatively safe situation. What have I learned after that? What I've learned after that is that with the QE programs, what we had is beyond the size of the balance sheet, there were now unmatched liabilities and assets. The Federal Reserve was borrowing short overnight and has been investing at the 10-year. Federal Reserve's balance sheet is a short-long hedge fund. It's a traditional bank. It borrows short and invests longs. That implies that changes in the yield curve or in the slope of the yield curve, as I plotted here simply just on the 1 year minus the federal funds rate, even at the very short end, and one could certainly do at the longer end, are going to lead eventually to the central bank in the last few years having made very high profits, and it sometimes is going to make very low profits when the yield curve simply flattens. It is inevitable, and no accounting schemes can hide that. At that point, and this is the point Bob was referring to, there's these two theorems that we proved a few years ago.
You're running out of time.
Yeah. There's these two theorems that we proved. The first one is that if the central bank always paid as dividends its net income, which implies that when it makes losses, it gets recapitalized, then this makes no difference. But this requires an enormous amount of fiscal support, and the central bank is recapitalized whenever it loses any money. However, if instead the central bank has limits in how much it can claw back its negative net income, then it will, with, in an extreme case, probability 1, become insolvent, by which we mean that its reserves become ultimately worthless in the sense of running a Ponzi scheme. So given that, how can the central bank, yeah, this is the last slide, sorry, okay. How can the central bank, what does this suggest the central bank should do? First, that a short treasuries only rule is a good rule, but that when it expands the balance sheet, the focus should be on the composition of the income risks that come, and as importantly, how do these interact with the amount of fiscal support it gets for the treasuries. Do not fall for traps such as the central bank can never go bankrupt or can always print money. Rather, think of the composition in terms of what fiscal risk it implies. So therefore, what is a new conventional balance sheet? I've already talked about this. This is very important for controlling prices, like when Pat said. It's not so important for the issues of the size of the balance sheet that I was going to discuss it. But in terms of deposits, that the interest rate on deposits is a new tool, the size is driven, endogenously satiated, and we can have discussion of digital currency. Whereas on the treasuries, the net worth, the crucial thing is they should, for the most part, always be short. And if one engages sometimes in QE, the key is how does the composition affect income risks and how clarified these lead to fiscal support. This is, I think, feasible, realistic, and involves a larger balance sheet and one where the composition in terms of income risks is used in exceptional terms during crisis.
Great, great, thank you. Okay, the second phase is throwing this open to Wampa and other members of the audience. You want to start? Or? Yeah, okay, good.
Okay, so one for Martin and one for Chris. So I revealed my type yesterday, so I'm not going to disagree with you on the main message. Actually, I'm going to endorse it forcefully. But a couple of things. One is we're talking about courage, which I appreciate. I work at the Fed. But there is an alternative interpretation, which is that if you are basically focused on the Nairo equation, and you see unemployment rate go to very, very low levels relative to what you thought was a natural rate, then you start hiking. The question is, when you say Europe got much better, do they have the unemployment rate going to levels that in the U.S. basically, according to this interpretation, push the rates? So in that case would be not that much courage or maybe luck. But that's and the second point is the part in which I'm going to disagree was in the part in which you say, well, the U.S. started increasing rates and actually inflation went up. I'm not disagreeing with the data. It is Fred, and Fred has to be thanked and respected. It's about the interpretation. If I still use my 3-year ignorance period, which is consistent with your 3 years, in which the short and the permanent and the 10 transitory components of nominal interest rate basically get together. And if I think about something that Giovanni was saying when you were speaking, that actually Europe had courage in your interpretation in 2012, and actually inflation went down, and then they put the rate down, and I understand that in Sweden something similar happened at some point. So maybe stressing the fact that in the US it went up it may not be the best idea, because in the other cases, then if it doesn't go up in 6 months, then that's a reason to lower the rate. And in your message, we should be emphasizing the permanent component and not the short-term bleeps. And for Chris...
Wampa, why don't we get an answer to that? And then okay. Maybe we'll come back to you later.
Okay, so the point that I was trying to emphasize was that if you take the same situation in Japan, for instance, Japan has been having zero interest rates since 1995 and has gone through a bunch of recessions and expansions. And you say, well, why didn't they increase interest rates when they went to the 3 or 4 expansions we had seen in Japan since 1985? And the answer to that is because the Bank of Japan saw that the inflation rate was significantly below target. So they worried that if they were to increase rates, they would worsen the inflation problem. Confronted with the same situation, the United States took a very different approach. They say the unemployment rate is low. Yes, it's true that inflation is significantly below target, but we are done. The purpose for which we lower interest rates all the way to zero is now no longer an issue, so we are going to normalize rates. It is in that particular comparative sense that I said that the U.S. approach took courage. But if you don't like the adjective courage, no problem.
Okay, yes.
If I may, I would like to ask the distinguished panel of speakers a question on negative interest policies that some central banks in advanced economies has implemented after global finance crisis. Would these negative interest policies could be one of the effective policy tool if central banks, another financial crisis would happen in the future? How would you appraise the effectiveness of negative interest policy so far that has been undertaken by several central banks in advanced economies?
Someone want to start? Go ahead.
Well, basically, I think that maybe at least for Korea, I think we could do some types of QE if we think it is necessary, even when we did not really reach zero interest rate. So probably if that is the case, we could avoid the case of negative interest rate. One reason why many central banks had to have this negative interest rate was just they tried to lower all the interest rate, and they finally interest rate reached zero. And then there is no other instrument to do, so that they had to rely on the QE. So that maybe if we think about the sequencing, probably then we could avoid this negative interest rate. And then actually I'd like to speak 1 or 2 minutes more on what I have to say. Actually, I think that interest is not just one. There are at least 2 interests, short and long. And basically, our framework is to focus on short term. We know that why we should have this short-term interest as an operating target is just this, it's easy to control it. But it looks like we are controlling short-term interest too much, so that a long-term interest was a little bit out of our hands. So basically, all these communications and forward guidance and whatever, I think this is an effort to affect long-term interest rate. I would not be surprised to find out the long-term interest rate was too much volatile sometimes, so that sometimes communication is not that much effective. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we should just give up maybe taking care of the long-term interest rate. Sometimes we could affect the long-term interest rate in the direction we want.
Does anyone else want to respond? Yeah, go ahead.
Very quickly, and again, let me stress, I'm speaking on my own personal capacity, so this is probably not the ECB's views here. But, I mean, the ECB has implemented negative rates, and, I mean, looking at the effects of negative rates, it seems that overall the transmission worked probably even surprisingly well. There have been relatively few issues here. I think the biggest concern is that the effect of negative rates probably depend on the duration of negative rates. So the longer negative rates are in place, the harder it is actually to sort of achieve the stimulating effects from there. And in particular, because negative rates tend to have a distributional effects on different types of banks. So banks who have a lot of deposit taking actually over the longer term face a problem because they take a lot of deposits, and the pass-through to deposit rates has been less than perfect because in nearly all of the cases, deposit rates are still bound at zero. So these banks effectively sort of struggle in the long term if negative rates stay in for a longer period of time. So I think the effectiveness of negative rates is very much dependent on the duration.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Andrew Ciconia with Banca d'Italia. A question for Professor Uribe. I just would like him to elaborate, if possible, on the mechanisms through which the current Eurosystem monetary policy stance, with specific reference to the euro area economy, is, in his opinion, counterproductive, in fact, deflationary. Thank you.
Why I think that the current monetary policy in the Eurozone is counterproductive? Well, I think that the focus should be on whether real variables have stabilized. And this has to do a little bit with Juanpa's question on the European part of Juanpa's question, which I didn't address. There is an argument for real conditions in Europe being significantly improved relative to what we saw in 2008 to 2012. now you cannot compare, say, unemployment rates in the periphery of Europe with unemployment rates in the US. You cannot compare unemployment rates in the periphery of Europe to unemployment rates in the core of Europe. If conditional on being careful about that, you have to conclude that real indicators are much, much stronger today than they were, say, in the period I referred to before, during the Great Contraction. So I think the European Central Bank should begin to think carefully about whether it is time to move to more normal rates. In particular, if it wants to buy insurance, that is to say, when the next contraction comes, to be in a situation to be able to apply monetary policy. So in that sense is that I say that Europe now is at the bifurcation point. If time goes by and they continue with interest rates at zero, soon enough they are going to fall into a BOJ situation in which interest rates are low because inflation is below target, and inflation is below target because interest rates are low. I think that a credible announcement of a gradual return to normal interest rates will not be deflationary. And I base that on theoretical grounds by simply implementing that particular policy in a very standard model, say in an NK model. And I base that also on macroeconometric grounds, say in terms of the models that I discussed yesterday. So based on those two, and I base that also on the experience of the US since 2015. So if I look at those three kind of sources of information, I can help but conclude that a credible gradual return to normal rates should not be deflationary.
Yes.
So this is a question for Dr. Waller. So you talked about the role of advanced communication, and you mentioned that it might be desirable for the Fed funds rate as well. Now, the challenge, though, is that if you start communicating 6 months ahead, you're not going to be able to talk about the rate, but you're going to have to talk about the reaction function, how incoming data are going to shape the future rates. And so the question, that's going to create a trade-off between simplicity of communication and how much advance notice you can give. Any views on that?
Yeah, no, I agree. What I was trying to get at is that there's been a lot of disconnect between what the markets thought we were potentially going to be doing because of our own communications, telling them here's the rate path we're going to put, and then we never did it. So that led to a lot of potential confusion about where the path of rates, are you actually going to do it? Now, I would say that the process of normalizing rates from very low levels up to something more normal is a different situation than when everything's back to normal and you're just dealing with standard fluctuations to the economy. I think the same thing applies, as you said, the more the public understands our reaction function, they'll be able to plug in whatever data they want and figure out what interest rate's likely to come out of it, which is what would happen in any sort of a Taylor rule. So my comments mainly were about when you're going from this exceptionally low level of rates to something more normal, you're going to have this kind of systematic path for the most part up, at least in your expectations. So there's nothing wrong with communicating that. But this is a clear point of discussion is once we get to that point, then we should probably just say, look, we're not giving you any more forward guidance. I think this is kind of what Michael was getting at.
Yes.
Question to Ricardo about the necessity for larger central bank balance sheet size than before. So I'm not still convinced that why the central bank provide a bunch of liquidity to satiate the liquidity demand. So of course we have currently the interest payment on excess reserve system, so we can supply a bunch of liquidity. But at the same time, most central bank has other facility like Lombard type lending system and setting a floor to the fluctuation policy interest rate. With that system, why we need to supply so bunch of liquidity to the market? So with the Lombard type lending system, I don't think that so much liquidity is necessary to satiate the liquidity demand.
I mean, the arguments are basically the ones I had in the slide, so I'll say them again. It's the Friedman rule. It's optimal for respective welfare. It leads to a better control of inflation because unlike in the corridor system, you don't have these liquidity shocks jacking your interest rate all the time. It better insulates you against big fluctuations in demand for liquidity like we had in 2008. Financial crisis will come and go, and there will be big fluctuations in the change for liquidity, and we can preemptively already make sure that they don't affect outcomes. It releases, satiating with liquidity releases other assets like short-term government bonds from having to provide liquidity services, and since they seem to be very scarce in the modern financial system, it seems like a good idea to release them. So I see a lot of virtues, and I don't see any virtue of the other alternative. As you said, well, but it wouldn't be so bad if we went back to having scarce reserves because we can bound them above through a ceiling like a discount window so they would never get very out of whack in terms of their opportunity cost. Yes, but that's not a benefit. That's a oh, the cost wouldn't be as high, and I listed a series of benefits. And so as a result, that's why I go towards the satiating for liquidity. I just don't see the benefit of having an interbank rate that fluctuates, yes, with a ceiling, but which doesn't bring any particular information, doesn't bring any welfare benefit that's well identified to really anyone in the economy. And providing abundant liquidity is the role of the central bank. And note, however, that I'm not, note that I said it was a min-max, meaning it's the minimum amount to satiate the amount of liquidity. So I'm saying the Fed now has 3 trillion of reserves. My estimates was that somewhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion, which is still much less than now, but that seems to be the amount that's necessary and needed. Let me also, unless you want to retort. The required. Why not increase required reserves? So I think was the question. Well, because required reserves are indeed a form of, if you're paying interest on reserves, then why require people to hold them? If they want to hold them, let them hold them. If they don't, they don't. Meaning, required reserves make sense when you don't pay interest on those reserves, or you're paying an interest rate lower than the market rate, but in that case, you're taxing the banks. Why would you engage in financial repression if you don't have to? Again, why are you deviating from the Friedman rule if you don't have to, and tax the financial system by forcing them to hold a denominated asset? Just give them what they want, which is liquidity that they want. Let me also add, just because the discussion has come up, if I can, Bob, on the discussion on the ECB, and raise just one preoccupation that I think Martine, or at least to complement Martine's view, which is, I mean, a difficulty that the ECB, I think, would face now is that if it raised rates, what would happen to the spread between, say, Italy and Germany? On the one hand, and I think that's an important consideration for the ECB's decisions, on the one hand, if you worry that would shrink, then you worry that Italy or Portugal and Greece would look similar to what happened to Argentina and Turkey in response to the rate hike in the U.S. That as you basically shrink the carry, people start looking at the fundamentals and start saying, well, it's really not worth having money invested in these countries. And these countries are still very fragile, I think, the capital flows in terms of the financial system. On the other direction, if you think that the spread would increase, that is, the interest rate on Italy would go up by quite a bit, then you worry that their public finances are still far from being optimal. So there are constraints both in terms of financial stability as well as public debt that have, I think, played an important role, at least in the ECB's decision when it comes to inflation. And that, a little bit like Martin says, it is a bifurcation point. But I would point, and I think the BIS, and Andrew would also say more, I mean, these change in interest rates at the point of financial fragility that some of the periphery in Europe is, both in terms of public debt and financial systems, I don't think would be second order, and they lead to a little bit of hesitation. I don't think they point necessarily to delaying or going against raising rates, but they do lead to some pause. Yeah.
One sentence on that?
Oh, sure.
Okay, there we go. Just to address Ricardo's point, which I think is a good point to bring forward. So what do we know about country spreads? Drawing from the evidence we have from emerging countries. One thing we know is that there is a systematic relationship between the real interest rate in the United States and country spreads in emerging countries. So the real interest rate increases in the US, country spreads increase in Argentina or any other emerging countries. That is a systematic relationship that is very robust. So the question is, what would happen if nominal interest rates were to be normalized in, say, Europe? Well, the evidence I showed you yesterday is that the real interest rate reacts very differently in response to a temporary increase in the nominal rate than to a permanent increase in the nominal rate. In particular, if the increase in the nominal rate is temporary, the input responses I showed you yesterday, the real interest rate increases temporarily. But if the increase in nominal rates, if the normalization of nominal rates is gradual and permanent, the transition is characterized by low real interest rates. So based on those two pieces of econometric evidence, I would say that the announcement of a gradual return to normal rates in Europe would be characterized by a transition with low real rates, and as a result, spreads would go down vis-a-vis the periphery of Europe.
Okay, let me make a remark. I hate to disagree with my co-author Ricardo, but it's not necessary to achieve any of the advantages of modern monetary policy for the central bank to have the portfolio. If you look at what the Fed does and other central banks do, the Fed sets the interest rate by running the RRP auction every day, in which they designate an interest rate, and in such a way that that interest rate becomes controlling in short-term credit markets. There's no reason why the Treasury couldn't do exactly the same thing. That would mean that they would just offer to borrow at a designated rate set by the Open Market Committee, and they would control rates in exactly the same economic way that the RRP works. And that would eliminate any need for the Fed to have a portfolio at all. It could just issue currency, and then as the currency expanded, it would just rebate the proceeds from issuing more currency to the Treasury, and that would be it. It's not the key thing that a central bank has is its monetary policy committee, not its portfolio. The Treasury could perfectly well execute everything that the Fed does today through the RRP, which is the controlling mechanism today for setting the interest rate in the U.S. economy. So, Ricardo, do you want to respond to that?
I completely agree. No, nothing I said.
Oh, good.
That would say that then that's precisely why I frame the policy not in terms of the quantity of reserves, but rather in terms of keeping the spread at something. So if the Treasury provides the goal of satiating liquidity, if you want, of issuing the ones that it wants, then simply the demand for the Fed ones will shrink from 1 trillion or half a trillion to zero, and everything I said would hold. I said exactly endogenously we want to make sure it's satiated, and if it's being satiated by one instrument or another, I said that was an endogenous choice rather than exogenous. So that would be consistent with what you said, I think.
Well, yeah, sure, go ahead.
Well, maybe Well, it is right. If ECB has this normalization, probably could have this impact on the spread, maybe between Germany and Italy and so on. But from the policymakers' viewpoint, probably if the spread becomes too large, then central bank will intervene in some way. I know that Europe has some very strict, maybe rule to intervene or buy the government bonds, etc. But normally when the spread becomes so big, then central bank intervenes anyway. So that probably so far, maybe, well, it was not that explicit for central bank intervene, maybe to reduce this fluctuation in the spread. But at least in the case of Korea, we had sometimes a wide fluctuation of the spread between countries, sometimes between short and long. And then right now, I think it's a real high time to think about maybe implementing some financial stability-related policies to reduce the spread. At the same time, we maintain some control on short-term interest rate, probably. So that central bank could develop different instruments to, conduct monetary policy. Even as I understand, Japanese central bank had now this QQE with the control, with yield curve control, so that basically when the amount of the government bonds are reduced that much, maybe they have now this, it looks like they had now this power to control exactly the long-term yield, at the same time the short-term anyway, so that depending on situation, central bank could devise different ways and tools, so that probably you don't need to worry about at this time whether this central bank had too much, maybe these assets and so on. I'm just wondering what is the exact notion of normalization? If the normalization means that we should back to the instrument of interest rate policy as an instrument of the monetary policy, then probably, well, already Japanese central bank came back to normalization because they no longer stick to the QQE. They just focus on controlling yield curve. So that in that case, I'm just wondering what is the why you should talk so much on this maybe the assets bought so far and so on.
Michael.
So I'm not sure who this question is precisely for, because it kind of touches on a few. And I wonder what the panel thought about the use of interest rate pads and published interest rate pads as a communication device. And linked to that, it sort of seemed to me that it links to Martin's point about a gradual normalization. That's one way to communicate it. But of course, one of the costs is these are always displayed as conditional. But I think markets take them as unconditional, and there's a question of volatility and reputational loss if you don't follow through. But the Norwegians seem to get away with it, but most of the countries haven't adopted them, so open to whoever.
Yeah, I'd say that's clearly been an issue that has been discussed. If you look at our SEP paths from the median voter on the rate path, the market always prices under that. So it's always been the struggle is why is the market, their path of the Fed funds rate lower than what the SEP is trying to signal. Now, one of the differences is we make ours all conditional. They tend to make it non-conditional. We never take into account that we might be going back to the zero lower bound in the next 2 to 3 years. The markets often think that that's part of the reason. So that's why rates are not going to be as high. But I think this has long been an issue about, is this an issue of credibility? I know my boss has talked about this. Is the market saying we don't really believe your path, or are we just basing it on different sets of conditioning assumptions so that they're comparing like apples and oranges?
So being out here in Asia, the central banks traditionally have been very interested in exchange rate developments and capital flows, especially gross capital flows coming from around the world. And so this question is more about monetary policy frameworks going forward. Should exchange rates play a more prominent role in monetary policy frameworks going forward in this? I mean, the argument is that in a greater globalized world where you have non-fundamental flows, here non-fundamental being not based on macro developments, but maybe based on the whims of asset managers and herding behavior in financial markets, should central banks play a much bigger role in dealing with that? And they have two tools. One is the interest rate, because we know interest rates have an impact on exchange rates, and also they have FX intervention. And certainly this region has been famous for using FX intervention techniques over the last 10 to 15 years to deal with exchange rates. So what does the panel think about the way forward? Should we go to the old Washington consensus of purely flex exchange rates and inflation targeting monetary policy, or should we sort of adopt some intermediate sort of model where you pay attention to exchange rates and also a number of domestic factors?
You want to start?
Well, I think it depends. If interest rate is effective in affecting Korean economy, for instance, then we could rely on interest rate. But as you know, in many major economies, interest rate was low to zero. So that probably there is a very small role for interest to play. So in that case, eventually exchange rate is supposed to play bigger roles. I think it will be the same for Korea, for instance. So that, depending on situation, maybe if we have just this normalization of interest rate, probably then we could rely more on this interest rate. But as I understand, always exchange rate is a very important variable, not just for Korea, but for all other major economies. So that this is always important. But whether we could use it, whether we do monetary policy to affect it, that's a little bit different. But anyway, I think so my answer is that it depends.
Any other panel member? Okay, we have time for one more question, one more remark. Yes.
I'm Gerald Franke from the Swiss National Bank. Again, question to Professor Uribe. What is your policy recommendation for the Bank of Japan? And what is your inflation projection based on the current framework, assuming that it will be maintained for an extended period?
Well, I'm not prepared to make projections, but I would say that if the Bank of Japan continues to keep nominal interest rates at zero for an indefinite period of time, all the sources that I have to inform me about what would be the path of inflation is that inflation is going to keep being very low. So I think that it's time for the Bank of Japan to follow the path of the United States and adopt a normalization of rates. If for any other reason, just looking at the record of its own past 25 years. The graph I showed you at the very beginning of my presentation today shows that Japan has had since 1995 4 recessions, therefore 4 recoveries. Interest rate has been zero throughout, and the only consistent pattern that we see is that inflation has been consistently below target, significantly below target. So just based on that, based on the evidence I showed for the United States, based on the econometric evidence I showed you yesterday, and on theoretical grounds as well, I would conclude that it would not be unreasonable for the Bank of Japan at least to consider a process of normalization of rates along the lines of what the United States has been doing since 2015.
Okay, that brings this panel to a close. Thank you very much.